So this session will be recorded and will be shared on YouTube afterwards and will also be sent to you afterwards. And for the folks who have requested closed captioning, we're not able to do it live, but as soon as we upload it, it will be closed captioned. And I think those are all the housekeeping notes I have for you, and I'll throw it back to Edgar to help take us to the next steps of this intro exercise.
Yes, thanks, Claire. So this, the purpose of this activity is to have us begin to question exactly what is natural and unnatural, and really just look at language for what it is. It's a way to communicate thoughts and concepts with one another. And so a lot of these words, both in all the slides, have been examples of language that people have given us while we've presented a different version of this, and just asking what is natural and unnatural. And so there's some of these are more on ecological terms and some of these are more like social political terms. And they change, right? The meaning of what is natural and unnatural can vary between that. So an example, we could just take lesbian or farming, for example. The way we've been conditioned is to assume that one is natural and unnatural. But both of them, if you look at farming from growing plants and feeding us, that in the way humans have interacted with the earth, one can argue that is natural, but then you can also argue the opposite, that, we're changing landscapes, we're diverting resources, and so that is an unnatural act in one way. Similar with lesbian, being falling in love with who, in this case, two women falling in love with each other or interacting with each other, could be a natural act, but then the way society has structured that, it's seen as an unnatural act. So, and that's mainly what this activity is to provoke and starting a fire, if you will, of what the stuff we're trying to move and deconstruct as we move forward through this. So here's a bunch of other images, and all these organisms that are on here display some sort of queer social behavior among themselves.
And here's the title slide I meant to share before. So you're here for celebrating queers in nature. I should have mentioned that. That's what we're doing here. We're celebrating queers, celebrating nature, and celebrating queers in nature.
So as we begin this, and one of the reasons we're not meeting in person is because of COVID, right? And so COVID is a virus, and viruses are part of nature. So as we go on with this, I just want us to just take a moment and take a step back to just reconnect with exactly what viruses are, and because they're the way the society has structured them, and we'll get into that in the next slide. So let me just go the natural part of it. They're microscopic, right? They're tiny, they're invisible, and there's millions and millions and millions of different varieties. They replicate only in living hosts, and so within their own evolution, they're either co-evolved at the very beginning of life and never got further, and they just kept attacking their neighbors, or they started evolving and then went back because they realized it was easier to just infect the other organisms that were able to keep them alive. But yeah, so on Earth, they infect everything. And most of my experiences with viruses has been with plants. I think as farmers, tomato mosaic virus is something that most of us interact with on a much more daily interaction. Well, I guess COVID now with everything going on. It's humans, but yeah, so they affect every life form on Earth: mushrooms, animals, plants, other viruses, other fungi, other bacteria and whatnot. But also humans, so they are a part of nature. But when humans begin to get involved and start using them and for our own reasons, we start turning this little unnatural pathway. And the way we've done that is we humans use viruses to infect bacteria, which will then pass the genetics that we want into the organisms we're trying to modify. Um, so right now, one virus, COVID-19 specifically, is changing the way humans organize themselves, but humans have always used viruses for our own needs. Next slide, please. So as we look at this virus, we are both trying to humanize it and turn it into a villain. And so we're trying, there's a lot of language of war and violence in how we address COVID. And it's the emphasis is on a conflict against the virus and escaping, or not escaping, but fighting for resources to combat it from nation to nation over this idea of cooperation. But the villain is all clear. We're all fighting the virus. We're at war with this virus, and the approach the U.S. has taken, for the most part, as we can see in our results and untangling of all this, is that we're kind of fighting this virus on our own, rather than cooperating with the rest of the world. And you know, if you look at the news and different mediums, you know, there's eradicate, destroy, defeat, conquer. You know, this is just replicates violence. Our approach from humans and what queer ecology is breaking down as we move forward is looking at nature from a point of domination. And so this is part of what the language is super important in how we communicate with each other. And that's part of what queer ecology is looking at that language to organize. And so, you know, we talk about front lines, everyone's on the front line, we're battling this virus. So, yeah, and one of the things I find really interesting is that the reason why we use war language, is I was doing a little bit of research just on this part, was because we're measuring the size of the pandemic by deaths as we measure war by the amount of people that die. And so I just thought that was really interesting that that is the marker. And I believe now we're at 210,000 deaths, maybe a little bit more, but we're up there. But yeah, next slide. So in order for us to move forward with just queer ecology and just what viruses are and in the way queer ecology incorporates not just COVID, but just the overall dynamic of everything moving on, is we got to like deconstruct some of that view, point of view, and specifically within the science. So because as we're looking for solutions to these ecological problems, we're looking at science as the solution. And we can, and within this political debate, there's this idea of science, believing the science and what, and not believing the science. But if we're on the science side and we're turning into facts and information to make informed decisions, it's also important to understand what is the framework of science that we're using, and specifically what we're bringing up in this presentation is how the ecological study structure framework has been created by colonialism, and how white supremacy and heteropatriarchy is infused into that, and how we continue to reinforce it. So part of this discussion is to just introduce you to these concepts, and then, you know, the rest of it happens as you take this back to your own spaces. So we're gonna do a little unlearning. So the first part of this structure of how science is laid up is that humans are there to extract from nature. And so the domination of humans is a reflection of the domination of nature. So, you know, nature is something to extract information, wealth, resources, but within humans, we create our own social structure. And this is what heteropatriarchy is. It creates power and privilege to a set of group of people. And in this case, you know, in this structure, power structure, you have men who benefit the most, followed by women. And then you have within that category, you have heterosexual folks have a power advantage over homosexual folks. And then that gets broken down again into cisgender with more rights and privileges than transgender. And so this is the way our society is set up. And as ecological knowledge was created, again, taking this idea of extracting from nature and conquering nature, this heteropatriarchal structure is infused into the academic work of, as we look at ecology and ecological sciences. So this is just a representation of basically another way of visually seeing the information. But the triangle diagram could be seen as egocentric or reinforcing this patriarchy. Because here you have a man at the top, and then the animals, create a pyramid below them. And then to the right, we have more of an ecocentric view where everything is connected and everything is dependent on each other, and it's more circular. Can you go back a slide? And just one other thing that's not included in this is racism and how that social reaction layer intersects with all of this, but we'll talk a little bit more of that as we move forward. Next slide. So the most important part of all of that before that I just mentioned is that ecology is a social construct. And that is, as we look at the solutions moving forward and thinking of the solutions that are necessary, we need to create a new social construct that takes into account the history of where this knowledge, how it's been produced, and who's produced it, and who has credit for all of this. And so in the case of ecology and botany, it's Carl Linnaeus. And so this is the system we use today. We do need a system to organize the information, but it's the problem here is that Linnaeus not only created the system, but created this idea of race and then the hierarchy that came within it. And also plants, animals, and other organisms were being classified with Eurocentric names. So essentially it was the white, educated, cisgendered, upper class folks who were not just quote unquote discovering, but were creating technology to keep these organisms alive. And so, for us as farmers, when we use a greenhouse, or plants that aren't necessarily indigenous to the regions that we live in, we use greenhouses to extend the season and whatnot. But the greenhouse technology is a result of colonialism. We humans had to create structures to maintain plants that do not live in these ecosystems. And so when you're working with these plants, and then at that time, in the 1700s, only super wealthy people had a greenhouse. And so that gives you a lot of intimate time to collect and hoard plants that then you get to quote unquote discover and publish all that. Do you want to take this one, or do you want me to?
Gotta mute myself. Yeah, so part of the Linnaean classification system of so the taxonomy of organizing the world and putting different types of life in a hierarchy involved looking at external reproductive parts of flowers in order to identify them. And we can see like the lineage of impact that approach has today, and that we have this idea that by looking at external reproductive structures, we can categorize an organism and a person. And so this is just sort of an example of, in the diagram, parts of a perfect flower. And one of the funny things about this is that if a flower has quote unquote male and female reproductive parts within it, then it's called perfect or bisexual. But that that logic doesn't necessarily translate to humans, or like there are far different associations of those words in humans. And then, yeah, well, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but the pollinating agents, this idea that we can't bring ideas we can't translate necessarily directly our ideas, and in particular Victorian ideas about sexual behavior back and forth from humans to plants. And so this idea that pollination / fertilization in humans only can and should only involve two parties, but if you look at all these other types of pollination in the natural world, sometimes it's by wind, sometimes there's always at least 3 agents involved in pollination. And sort of these are the troubling of the of Linnaeus and traditional understandings of ecology and botany. I think back to you, Edgar.
Yeah, so where does this leave us? So that's just kind of where the history was, or where the science is coming from, because we need science to move forward. We need science to solve the solutions of climate chaos. And so what exactly is climate chaos? It is an understanding or acceptance that there's a higher increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so the beauty of our planet is not so much the chemistry, it's the biology. And so it took millions of years of plants catching carbon, turning it into a solid, and then the earth bearing everything, giving it a big tight hug, and turning all that captured sunshine into fossil fuels. So the carbon's always been here. It was just the way the plants have moved it around and turned it from a gas to a solid. What's happened recently is that humans have found this and found the power of fossil fuels, and have, and we as a society have become dependent on it. So all this extra carbon is being flushed back into the atmosphere, and so that's just changing the weather. That's going to change the climate for generations to come. And so the difference between climate change and climate chaos: climate change doesn't add the urgency, but more importantly, I feel like it creates this idea that we can change back, like we can go back. Whereas climate chaos is more, the future is uncertain, and we need to create adaptations to that chaos, create the order within chaos, and just live within these smaller feedback loops, based on how we're adapting to what the future has. So yeah, so that essentially was, and then here's just a graph of just carbon emissions. The magenta line is just atmospheric carbon, and then the blue line is how much we've been pumping the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. And essentially around from the 60s, it's just going up. What does this do? It makes hurricanes bigger and stronger. It creates bigger droughts, which then link to larger fires. Insects are swarming all over the world, and now the latest addition to this is a global pandemic. So, and so I just wanted to share just what's currently going on as we're presenting. Well, one, Hurricane Delta, which is the 25th storm of the season, and currently it's a Category 4. They predict it's going to get to Category 5 by tomorrow, but it's on its way to hit Louisiana, which has already been hit a few times. And then this will be the 10th storm that makes landfall, which is going to set a new record for the U.S. Another thing with the fires is that we're not necessarily coining new words, but we're reintroducing language that hasn't been seen on Earth for a while. And this term would be a gigafire, and it's a blaze that burns at least 1 million acres. And so the August complex fire that California just experienced was the first fire in California since humans started recording, where we've reached 1 million acres in one event. At least in California. This also happened in Australia this last, I guess our winter, their summer. Actually, it was our spring, their fall. It was before their winter rain showed up. And then these fires just decline air quality. And here's just a map of just air pollution along the West Coast. And then the east-south coast of the country is being bombarded by water. So, and then here is another image is just infection rates of COVID. And then actually, just to speak a little bit, I guess we can leave this slide up. Just to speak a little bit on this, I had found a slide from the CDC, from the US CDC, that went up to July. And when I was working on this, I had that slide, that graph saved in another file. And then when I was editing this, I deleted that by accident. And then I tried finding it, data from the CDC, from the US CDC, and it was gone. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. So anyway, so this image of COVID is from the European CDC, and it goes all the way to May. But essentially, what I'm just trying to show here is that there's a correlation between the increase of carbon emissions and then COVID. It's the same type of pattern.
Do you want to speak to about the science that we're using for our solutions before we jump into queer ecology?
Yeah. And so that's a great point. So the science that we're looking as far as our within carbon emissions is that there's approaches of using technology to capture the carbon and depending on that technology, rather than looking at solutions that land practices that incorporate carbon sequestration. The way these ecological systems need to be managed, we need to step away from the zero-centric approach of land management and incorporate indigenous methods of interacting with these ecosystems to prevent we need to work with indigenous communities to incorporate their knowledge with how we can navigate the next 1,000 years. The ecological knowledge that they developed wasn't like a 1-2 generation thing, it was multiple generations. And moving forward, we need to figure out a way to incorporate passing that ecological knowledge for all the people who live in an area. Not everyone needs to be an active role of, participating in ecological action, but, there are things that we as a community can collectively hold each other to let the people who do want to be more active take those roles.
Yeah, so we've referenced a bit this idea of queer ecology, and it is not completely, it is related to all this. It's the line that ties all of these different disparate ideas together, in this idea of the particular way we've been practicing science has a history, has a particular historical origin, and it has a goal of preserving, and because of those origins, it leads to a certain sort of hierarchy and preservation of unequal power relations. And queer ecology is a response to that colonial ecology. And yeah, so let's talk about what queer ecology is. And Jennifer, I saw your question about queer. I don't know that this is a very Eleanor-centric definition, but yeah, I don't know if this is a definition for all, but for our purposes, here's a definition of queer. So an umbrella term, it's wide, it's inclusive, but mostly in response to what are these normative categories. And what we're interested in with queer ecology is what's considered normal, what's considered natural, bringing us back to where we started. Why is it considered normal and natural, and what are the implications of that? So queer is the non-normative, and then ecology is the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So there's nothing inherent in that definition that says ecology has to represent and uphold heteronormative, cisnormative, or what we call reprocentric, so a focus on reproduction, sexual reproduction. There's nothing about that definition that says ecology has to be that way. But that is certainly how it's been practiced. So queer ecology, I'll be honest with you, is hard to define, and that's the whole darn point. It sort of is, it questions boundaries and binaries and restrictions and constraints. And so it's hard to encapsulate, but so we come at it from a couple different angles, but primarily it's a lens through which we're viewing, exploring, and understanding the world. And it's a defiant lens. It says whatever, it's a questioning, critical lens, but also a celebratory one. But it's saying, what are the existing power structures? What are the existing ways of describing the world? And are they true? Do they just, who created them, and who benefits from this understanding of ecology? It's an interdisciplinary field of study. It looks at the intersection of queerness and ecology, and fundamentally responds to purported heteronormativity and reprocentricity. So, and it's helpful in understanding what queer ecology is in terms of thinking of what is described as a crime against nature. So much of non-normative behavior is called a crime against nature, and what that, it gets at a really foundational element of us as humans, of saying, whatever you are, whatever you're doing, it's against nature, it's unnatural, and that hits us at a deep point. And what we're saying with queer ecology is some of what you've been told about what is natural isn't actually true, and it's just been there to make certain people feel better than other people, give more people power, that sort of thing, domination, etc. So queer ecology is also many other things. That is, let's see if I can nail this. It's a roly-poly couple looking for a third. Polyamory, roly-polyamory is the other way of thinking about it. Yeah, it's a way for us to acknowledge the existence of queer behavior and identities among plants and non-human animals. It's saying we as humans are not different or weird for having the expressions and bodies and identities and relationships that we have. There's actually a lot of examples of who we are in our plant and animal and fungi family. And it's a validation for LGBTQ people who are often told that their identities and behavior are deviant and unnatural. So we're reclaiming the knowledge of plant and non-human beings lost to colonization and white supremacy. We know that the earth and all of its inhabitants have so much to teach us. We have so much to learn from them. And we're reclaiming that knowledge and saying that humans are not the only holders and practitioners of knowledge. And queer ecology is creative and solution-based. And let's see if I can pull this off. I'm trying to share a link with you. So queer ecology, like I said, hard to encapsulate. I've shared mycelial map is what I'm calling it. And these are all of my ideas. Hopefully you can click through to that link. I think you might need to put your name in. But that's a mapping out of all of the topics that I explore in my study of queer ecology, and all of the different connections and where places that queer ecology shows up. And yeah.
One thing I wanted to add to this is that queer ecology, just kind of like all these things that Claire mentioned, but once we get this basic framework, a lot of internal work will come out of this, was just, especially if for people who work with youth, we want to teach science. It's important for us to teach ecological concepts moving forward, because we all need to sequester carbon, and as farmers, we play a big role in that, in sequestering carbon. We also want the next generation to do that, have the ecological skills, but be able to leave some of this heteronormative language and concepts, understandings behind, because the way ecological natural systems are taught to it through, well, at least I'll speak for myself, my educational youth, it was, again, making queer is unnatural, but then we internalize this stuff. This becomes internalized, and that, the solutions to the future involve us to be honest to ourselves, be comfortable with who we are, because if we're spending emotional, mental, social energy still suppressing and not believing that we are natural, we're not going to show up to the solutions to climate chaos like we need to. And so queer ecology, I see it a lot as an organizing tool, because some of these, a lot of what we're talking right now is the theory, but then the way we put it into practice is moving with people, educating people, working alongside, growing plants together, you know, talking about harvesting together, and then understanding that these zucchini came from flowers, and then having that discussion of flowers and what does that mean and whatnot. So it's a way to reframe what we've been taught and to do some unlearning and reconnecting.
Yeah, and practicing self-love and acceptance. And that was when I first learned about queer ecology, what resonated so strongly for me. So as Edgar was saying, if we're thinking of traditional ecology and traditional botany as ways of organizing, but organizing for the sake of maintaining unequal power relations and valuing some bodies and expressions over others, what if queer ecology is a response to that, that says that, you know, if your framework says that so much of life is bad or wrong or unnatural or abnormal, then perhaps the problem isn't with that expression or that organism or that, you know, person or that body, but it's with your framework. Your framework is what is making that unnatural, abnormal, bad, etc. So if we change our framework and Edgar and I have both found queer ecology to be a really effective tool in that. What if we used queer ecology as an organizing tool, not to organize some people above others and some forms of life above others, but to organize collectively towards mutual collaboration and support? What if that was the sort of organizing that we took on? So queer ecology may still be a little abstract out there. We're going to share a few examples of how queer ecology shows up. So the first, you may recognize that beautiful person with the conch. So usually, if I get Edgar to laugh, it's a good workshop. So usually, as I mentioned before, we have this queer farmer field day every fall on the farm. That was a lot of F's. And about 10 plus years ago, we have a farmer training program that usually runs in normal years. And about 10 years ago, some queer farmers in our farmer training program decided to start a queer farmer field day. And the original intention was, I mean, first of all, just to welcome queer folks on the farm and show them this is a queer space. Like, you may have only seen farmers represented as straight white men with their beautiful wife and their sweet little baby, even in sustainable ag worlds. But in fact, queer people are also farmers, not only can be, but are also farmers. And in particular, the Queer Farmer Field Day started as a way of showing high school queer youth that farming is a viable career path. And it's been a really wonderful day of celebration and flowers and food and always lentils somehow, and a lot of joy on the farm. And so we're trying to bring some of that vibe. Maybe somebody can bring some lentils to this. Yeah, hopefully next year be back on the farm in person. And then a related event is the Pansy Plant Out, and Edgar can share about that.
Yeah, so the Pansy Plant Out is another event we held on the farm. And essentially, there's a project called the Pansy Project, and it's kind of a reactive approach to hate crimes, LGBTQ hate crimes specifically. And after the scene of a hate crime, people would come and do a little bit of guerrilla gardening and then put pansies around a space, one to add flowers, but really to reclaim it together after the act of violence. And so, and you know, pansies have been used as a derogatory term for gay, feminine men. And so the Pansy Plant Out was a proactive approach of, rather than being defensive and waiting for violence to happen, we planted pansies out at the farm to welcome and then put the intentions of queerness into the farm itself.
And I'll also add that we did a follow-up pansy plant out following the shootings at the Pulse nightclub. Edgar and I came into work, we were working together at that point the next day, and we had a tray of pansies and 50 of them for every person who lost their life, and had a ceremony and then planted the pansies. And so these acts of reclaiming plants and derogatory terms, and actually the origin of pansy is pensier, the French word for thoughtful, which I think is really lovely. And so it's a way of taking, can we reinfuse the thoughtfulness and the care and the human sentiment and grief back into these plants, and not just let them be used as derogatory terms. And then Edgar, did you want to talk about your work?
Yeah, I think there should be a slide or two after this.
I don't think so. I can go find something.
No, it's fine. So I work in San Francisco. The farm that I manage is called Hummingbird Farm, and it was built or organized. It's a 6-acre farm in the city itself. So it's 6 acres in San Francisco, and it's no joke trying to get land here. So, but there was when Clare and I were in Santa Cruz, there was a group of youth in San Francisco organizing, and they call themselves Urban Campesinex. And so for those folks not familiar, in a lot of in Spanish, because Spanish is a gendered language, a lot of the new there's been a coinage of Latinx, or adding an X at the very end of the word to remove both the O and the A and the gendering of the word itself, but also to incorporate diaspora and just different elements of intersectionality, and really just removing the binary from the language, and creating the way to using language, creating new language to have conversations that reflect where we are today. So Urban Campesinex puts an X after campesino, which is the Spanish word for farm worker or farmer. And so these youth organized, did all the whole city politics stuff before I was involved. But they they got the land, and then once we celebrated that they got the land, and they started working, very few of them actually knew what they were doing. As far as like land actual work, they were great organizers, but they were starting farmers. And so actually that coincided when I left Santa Cruz, and then I ended up joining up with them, and I've been with them now for 3 years, and we've really taken not just the organizing element of self-reflective of calling ourselves Urban Campesinex, but really incorporating that into the land itself. One of the big things we've done in the last 2 years, the milpa, or this idea of the 3 sisters. We've been having this discussion around moving beyond this idea of sisters as of just 3 women, because again we're implementing the gender onto the plants and their relationship with each other. And so we've converted the way we're using the language on the farm. Again, we're still valuing these 3 crops: corn, squash, and beans, but then we're calling them hermanex, which again is Spanish for sibling, but again removing the O and the A, adding the X. But in English, we're using siblings, elders, ancestors, crops, just really being intentional of not reinforcing this idea of sisters. Because then another thing we're incorporating into the dialogue and the discussion as we're interacting with these plants is looking at companion planting and family structures in a more contemporary lens, where it's not just 3 individuals that have known each other forever. It's like, yes, there's corn, squash, and beans, but then there's some cilantro and some onions, which are plants that, when these ideas of the 3 original sisters came together, they're not incorporating these other plants that are part of our diet. So we have these traditional plants and crops that we've that we've co-evolved with, but then we have these cultural plants that came through either through colonization or through times of peace, but have been infused into our diets, in our culture. And this is super important because as we're talking about the future within this queer lens of like thinking of other family structures, then this opens the opportunity, like what are the plants that we need to grow that can grow here, that are not necessarily part of our diets now, but we can make them into the future. Because we got to reduce our carbon footprint, and part of that is eating locally. And again, it's 6 acres on the farm in San Francisco, and we're not necessarily trying to feed San Francisco because that would be impossible, but we're trying to organize San Francisco and build coalitions with farmers, larger farmers that then can feed San Francisco.
All right, so that's a little bit about how queer ecology can show up. It shows up in our work. As ever, we're queering the schedule, so we're running a little behind, just a heads up. But what we thought now is we could jump into, and totally optional, but you have the option of going into a breakout group. And if I can handle this, yeah, I think I could do that. Yeah, you should get the option. And if you don't want to go in the breakout room, you can hang out here with us, no worries. But we're gonna give some discussion questions to share some thoughts that are coming up. How can queer ecology be used to cope with COVID and climate chaos? Or where are you seeing some possibilities here? And how is queer ecology a building block for the world we want to create in the future? So in small groups, and what else? Yeah, just we'll probably just be in there about 5 minutes, but an opportunity for you to share your thoughts as they're coming up with some other folks. So have fun, and yeah, introduce yourselves and share these thoughts. And I will copy this. Oh no. I'll see if I can send it to you while you're in your groups. Okay, have fun. Did you all get a message to go? Okay, good.
Just unmuted us.
I saw that it actually works.
Claire, can you see us, hear us?
I can see and hear. Hi.
Hi. We just wanted to say hi and thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
Thank you for this. So good.
Thanks for joining. I'm trying to figure out how to copy.
Oh, sorry. I'll
No.
not distract you.
Here we go.
Hi Claire, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm an agroecology student and queer student as well. I'm a junior at the moment. Yeah, I'm a junior at the moment. I have to go now-ish. I was wondering if there's a way, if I could just email you if I have more questions, if I want to talk more about queer ecology at UCSC, internships and stuff. Can I just email you personally? Is that okay?
Yes. I'm putting my email in the chat, and just feel free to follow up. And you'll get a recording of this session, and we'll share some resources through that.
Oh, awesome.
But yeah, feel free to email me, internships, all that stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Edgar. You were incredible. This was really beautiful. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
The other day, Edgar, I don't think Claire, have you met Hudit, who's the co-executive director at Life Lab? She's new, and the other day in our Jedi's meeting, she was talking about the X. That green thing. That's me talking. The X in like Campesine X. Eleanor, hold on so I can talk, please, love. And anyway, she brought up, she was talking about difference between how it's going in Mexico versus here, and changing the language from binary to non-binary. And she was bringing up something some people are doing instead of Campesine X. I think it was Campesine A with an E. Yeah. Have you heard that at all, or what do you? Yeah.
Yes, that is happening. That tends to happen more south of the border. I would say the X is more similar to Chicano, where it's a little bit more political because of just the dynamics of being a person of color in the U.S.
Yep.
Right.
and how race relations show up here. But yeah, the A, I think the A is smoother, like it comes off smoother. But the X is a little bit more like harsh and intentional.
Yep.
I think I feel like the E is going to be easy for people to absorb, especially an older generation. But yeah, I do know that blurring of the gender and the language with the E is much more prevalent in South America, Mexico.
Yeah, that's exactly what she was saying, that here it's X, just exactly what you said. And so at Life Lab, we're working on, like, the website is in Spanish now, and just working on combing through all of our curriculum. And anyway, yeah, we were talking about how going with the X, because that's what's happening here, and it is more of a statement and just more culturally relevant here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, as a go
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think your point is spot on, Edgar. Just that as a contrast to the very stark gender binary, using the X really, it catches your attention, right? It makes you really realize. Whereas I think, as you said, the E is a little softer approach, and it's cool too. It's different. It's not binary, but I think in the politics of the U.S., the X is a much stronger statement.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a rich discussion. And we'll have time afterwards. We'll try to end close to 7. And then if folks want to hang out, please hang out. That's usually how this event runs, is people just sort of linger. And I'm having trouble letting go of that element of it. I don't want to kick you all out at 7. So opportunities to connect and share more. So yeah, we wanted to send you off with some resources, and so here are a few up there. Those are some favorites of mine, some podcasts and some books. And let's see if I can pull up my other, there we go. And I've got a link for you. So there's a Google Doc where I've been collecting some queer ecology resources. So that's books, podcasts, websites, projects. I really want to highlight the Queer Eco Justice Project. They're doing some really cool work. And if you're looking to continue to connect with folks over this sort of thing, they've often held queer ecology nodes, where small groups geographically based, but maybe not during COVID, actually, now that I think about it. So if you want to be talking with people, Queer Eco Justice Project is a great space for that. Edgar, I don't know if you have other resources you want to share.
I think these are a good start. And then we have that document too.
Yeah. Yeah. We have actually, I was rushing through. If anyone wants to ask any questions, we have time for, I think, 1 or 2 questions.
Comments are good too. Reflections.
Or yeah, resonance, anything that resonated. Oh, somebody raised their hand. Assuming I can answer. Allison, if you can unmute yourself, I can figure out how to do that.
Cool. I just had a question sort of, you know, about the change in terminology from 3 sisters to either 3 ancestors or 3 elders or 3 siblings. And so I'm just wondering how that intersects, I guess, with the concept of like the divine masculine and the divine feminine, and like how that all comes into play. Like how can you recognize that without enforcing gender?
That's a good question. That's something that's actually come up in part of our circles, and more as it's one thing we've kind of touched base on, is that this divine masculine feminine is a spectrum, and then again, by focusing on like just one or the other, we're forgetting everything that exists, that is both and none at the same time. And so in the ecology is a social construct, so regardless of which point of view of society you're coming from. We're all here now, and all these layers of colonialism and pre-colonial ecological knowledge exist simultaneously. And so navigating forward is kind of dealing with some of these contradictions that we don't necessarily have a solution yet, but it's because of these conversations that we're getting somewhere. But yeah, I think one of the things that we've kind of, because the queer ecology, you know, it's, although, you know, we talk about it and everything we've discussed, that's the theory, but then trying to convince an older person who's been growing the same way for 30 years, that is part of where this, like, we're fusing this new stuff with what their ecological knowledge is. And sometimes it's not just even farmers, it's like the other end, like the more like spiritual grounded folks that are still seeing the nature in this binary way. So it's at least on the farm we do ceremony, and so we do have a lot more of these conversations of how do we acknowledge the divine, but not continue to binarize. I don't know if that's a word, but honor the divine without forcing it into a binary.
And it's not completely related, but this is a cool book, Meaningful Flesh, if you're interested in like religion and queerness and religion and nature for a queer planet. And it just has a really beautiful cover, so that's half the reason I'm just showing it to you. So I recommend that if you're interested.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's 7. I just want to share. I won't kick you out. Please hang out, ask questions. So thank you for coming to the Harvest Festival. And usually this is a free event, or actually, no, usually it's not a free event, but it is free this year. And so if you have some extra change to share, these are some of our, some organizations we've picked for you to send your resources to support. And I also wanted to say, if you're a UCSC student, and you're interested in doing internships with the Center for Agroecology and the Sustainable Food Systems, aka the UCSC Farm and Garden, feel free to email me, or Damien is the other guy. And I just dropped those in the chat. So you can follow up there. And yeah, I think that's it for us in an official level, so I'll stop sharing. And if folks want to hang out and chat, that sounds great. But if not, thank you so much for your time and for showing up, and would love to continue the conversation. Edgar, I don't know if you had other thoughts to share.
No, thank you. I put my email in the chat. I will maybe not get to it right away, but I will get to it. Just FYI.
I can confirm that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I am a 4th year agroecology student at UCSC, and I guess I was just wondering if there is going to be like not that it would apply to me because I want to graduate, but is there gonna be like a queer ecology class at some point?
You know, I don't think probably at the university level, but I think if there's enough interest, we could definitely get a study group going. Or it could be sort of, I don't know if you've done ESLP, that course, the student-led environmental studies course.
Yeah.
That seems like another great avenue for it. But as far as I know, there's nothing in the works, but happy to help orchestrate a, co-learning space if enough folks are interested.
Totally. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Alessandra. I'm a 3rd year PhD student at the University of Kentucky in sociology. And first of all, thank you. This was excellent. And the idea of a working group, I don't know if you were even considering, making it outside of your university. But I know personally, I feel very alienated from any other queer scholars. So I would love to just help with that in any way possible.
Awesome. Cool. Well, maybe we can connect, and feel free to send me an email to get that conversation going. That sounds really cool. We have some icebreakers if folks want to stay and hang out but are shy, but also open to questions. And that may be, icebreakers may be sending people away. I don't know. Maybe that was the wrong. Oh, and no, I don't have, I have ice cream for me, but not for everyone, sorry.
Let's do an icebreaker.
Okay, cool. So what is the queerest plant or organism you know or love, and why?
Gay penguin.
I kind of want you to leave it at that, but I also want you to maybe share a little bit more.
I don't know. It was just one of the first, like, hey,